Victor Hugo was born in 1802 in Besançon, which is in France. He wrote over the course of 60 years, publishing his first novel when he was 20 years old. He wrote 12 novels and about 45 other works during his lifetime, and another 20 writings of his were published after his death. He also served as a senator for about 6 years, and when Napoleon III took over the government in a coup in 1851, Hugo called him a traitor to France, and so then he had to leave. He lived in exile for about 20 years, first in Brussels, and then he eventually made his way to the island of Guernsey in the English Channel. And this is a nice example of how a good writer is often a bad politician, because a good writer has to be honest. And if somebody takes over the government and you think that they're a traitor to your country, then you might be impelled to say so, and that might be good writing and bad politics. Hugo has a number of musical connections. He was friends with Hector Berlioz and Franz Liszt, and he was also on good terms with Chopin and attended Chopin's funeral in 1849. There are over 100 operas based on Hugo's writing. Some of the better-known ones are Lucretia Borgia by Donizetti, Rigoletto by Verdi, and La Gioconda by Ponchielli. Hugo himself really enjoyed music, in particular that of Mozart, Beethoven, Gluck, and Weber, as well as older composers like Palestrina and Monteverdi, which was less common at the time. He also produced more than 4,000 drawings. That was a secondary interest for him, which he started doing as an amateur, but as he did it more, he got better at it. And aside from his writing, his drawings are quite interesting. They're kind of surreal, dreamlike. They have an interesting style. You can pull them up easily if you search Victor Hugo drawings. Hugo also reportedly said that, quote, "A war between Europeans is a civil war," end quote. And he was a strong advocate for a unified Europe. Victor Hugo died in 1885 in Paris. He was given a state funeral at the Pantheon of Paris, which 2 million people attended, and which to this day remains the largest funeral in French history. The novel of Hugo's at which we're going to be looking today is titled 93. It's Hugo's last novel. The title is named for the year 1793, which is the year in which the Reign of Terror in the French Revolution began. In particular, Louis XVI, the reigning king at the time, was beheaded in January of 1793. But the most violent period of the Reign of Terror is generally dated from September 1793 to July 1794. It's this particularly bloody period of the French Revolution. And the terror is mostly going on in the background of this novel, but it's part of the context. More of the action focuses on the war in the Vendée, which was a reaction against the French Revolution, a counter-revolution that went from 1793 to 1796 in the Vendée region in France, and the other being the Chouannerie, which was a similar royalist uprising, which was named after the Chouan brothers, who were two of its leaders, and it took place in Brittany and Maine, which are in western France, on and off between 1794 and 1800. And this is an aspect of the French Revolution that isn't emphasized in short summaries of it, that there was a civil war on a low burn in the background, in particular of the early years, but pretty much up to the point when Napoleon I took over in 1799. And this is another reason why it's useful to look at revolutions, whether you're talking about the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, the Iranian Revolution, as periods rather than events. The cartoon character image that we can get is that there was some light switch event that we can point to that was the revolution, and then everything after that event was some kind of mopping up operation to get everybody else on board. In the American context, we might say this was the Declaration of Independence. In the French context, it might have been the execution of Louis XVI. In the Bolshevik context, we could say the abdication of Nicholas II. In the Iranian one, the return to Iran of Khomeini. And these were all significant events, but in all four cases, the show was far from over, and it wasn't even clear exactly what direction things were going to go in, or that the revolution was not going to be thwarted and reversed. So I find it's more useful to think about a period, often of a decade or longer, during which major social, political, components, leaders, social stratification, economic order, are in play in a way that they are not during periods that we think of as not revolutionary. Most of the time, these components are settled, they don't move very much, but when there's a period in history when there is a perception that they can be, and when they are significantly disturbed and rearranged, that's a revolution, or a revolutionary period. And in this novel, 93, we are looking at the period after the king has been executed, but there are still royalists who want to overturn the republic and restore the monarchy. And they want this badly enough to fight and die for it. And this novel explores some interesting moral questions about responsibility in this kind of uncertain political context, about the difference between deontological and consequentialist ethics. Is ethics to be evaluated based on set rules of behavior or based on the consequences of behavior? It also looks at the tension between political goals and allegiances and a loyalty to humanity generally. But now we can get into some passages from 93 by Victor Hugo. And though not all books that we've looked at on this podcast meet this description, this is a book for which knowing the whole plot before you start reading it would take something away from the experience of reading it if you haven't before. So I'm going to do my best to avoid giving away anything major in case you haven't read it. And this first passage I'm going to read happens to be the longest one that we're going to look at today, but it comes up relatively early in the book, and I think you'll see why I wanted to quote it at such length. The characters are on a ship, and something goes very wrong. And it's worth it to know that a carronade is a type of cannon, and a 24-pounder is a cannon whose projectile weighs 24 pounds. So this is a relatively large cannon. Hugo writes, quote, "A frightful thing had just happened. One of the carronades of the battery, a 24-pounder, had got loose. This is perhaps the most formidable of ocean accidents. Nothing more terrible can happen to a vessel in open sea and under full sail. A gun that breaks its moorings becomes suddenly some indescribable supernatural beast. It is a machine which transforms itself into a monster. This mass turns upon its wheels, has the rapid movements of a billiard ball, rolls with the rolling, pitches with the pitching, goes, comes, pauses, seems to meditate, resumes its course, rushes along the ship from end to end like an arrow, circles about, springs aside, evades, rears, breaks, kills, exterminates. It is a battering ram which assaults a wall at its own caprice. Moreover, the battering ram is metal, the wall wood. It is the entrance of matter into liberty. One might say that this eternal slave avenges itself. It seems as if the power of evil hidden in what we call inanimate objects finds a vent and bursts suddenly out. It has an air of having lost patience, of seeking some fierce, obscure retribution. Nothing more inexorable than this rage of the inanimate. The mad mass has the bounds of a panther, the weight of the elephant, the agility of the mouse, the obstinacy of the ox, the unexpectedness of the surge, the rapidity of lightning, the deafness of the tomb. It weighs 10,000 pounds, and it rebounds like a child's ball. Its flight is a wild whirl abruptly cut at right angles. What is to be done? How to end this? A tempest ceases, a cyclone passes, a wind falls, a broken mast is replaced, a leak is stopped, a fire dies out. But how to control this enormous brute of bronze? In what way can one attack it? You can make a mastiff hear reason, astound a bull, fascinate a boa, frighten a tiger, soften a lion. But there is no resource with that monster, a cannon let loose. You cannot kill it, for it is dead, while at the same time it lives. It lives with a sinister life bestowed on it by infinity. The planks beneath it give it play. It is moved by the ship, which is moved by the sea, which is moved by the wind. This destroyer is a plaything. The ship, the waves, the blasts all aid it, hence its frightful vitality. How to assail this fury of complication? How to fetter this monstrous mechanism for wrecking a ship? How foresee its comings and goings, its returns, its stops, its shocks? Any one of these blows upon the sides may stave out the vessel. How divine its awful gyrations? One has to deal with a projectile which thinks, seems to possess ideas, and which changes its direction at each instant. How stop the course of something which must be avoided? The horrible cannon flings itself about, advances, recoils, strikes to the right, strikes to the left, flees, passes, disconcerts ambushes, breaks down obstacles, crushes men like flies. The great danger of the situation is in the mobility of its base. How combat an inclined plane which has blind caprices? The ship, so to speak, has lightning imprisoned in its womb which seeks to escape. It is like thunder rolling above an earthquake. In an instant, the whole crew were on foot. The fault was the chief gunner's. He had neglected to fix home the screw nut of the mooring chain and had so badly shackled the four wheels of the carronade that the play given to the sole and frame had separated the platform and ended by breaking the breeching. The cordage had broken so that the gun was no longer secure on the carriage. The stationary breeching which prevents recoil was not in use at that period. As a heavy wave struck the porthole, the carronade, weakly attached, recoiled, burst its chain, and began to rush wildly about. Conceive, in order to have an idea of this strange sliding, the movements of a drop of water running down a pane of glass. At the moment when the lashings gave way, the gunners were in the battery, some in groups, others standing alone, occupied with such duties as sailors perform in expectation of the command to clear for action. The carronade, hurled forward by the pitching, dashed into this knot of men and crushed 4 at the first blow. Then, flung back and shot out anew by the rolling, it cut into a 5th poor fellow, glanced off to the starboard side and struck a piece of the battery with such force as to unship it. Then rose the cry of distress which had been heard. The men rushed toward the ladder. The gun deck emptied in the twinkling of an eye. The enormous cannon was left alone. She was given up to herself. She was her own mistress and mistress of the vessel. She could do what she willed with both. The whole crew of the corvette, men accustomed to laugh in battle, trembled now. To describe the universal terror would be impossible. Captain Boisberthelot and Lieutenant Viovilla, although both intrepid men, stopped at the head of the stairs and remained mute, pale, hesitating, looking down on the deck. Someone pushed them aside with his elbow and descended. It was their passenger, the peasant, the man of whom they had been speaking a moment before. When he reached the foot of the ladder, he stood still. The cannon came and went along the deck. One might have fancied it the living chariot of the apocalypse. The marine lantern oscillating from the ceiling, adding a confusing whirl of lights and shadows to the strange vision. The shape of the cannon was undistinguishable from the rapidity of its course. Now it looked black in the light, now it cast weird reflections through the gloom. It kept on its work of destruction. It had already shattered 4 other pieces and dug 2 crevices in the side, fortunately above the waterline, though they would leak in case a squall should come on. It dashed itself frantically against the framework. The solid tie beams resisted, their curved form giving them great strength, but they creaked ominously under the assaults of this terrible club, which seemed endowed with a sort of appalling ubiquity, striking on every side at once. The strokes of a bullet shaken in a bottle would not be madder or more rapid. The 4 wheels passed and repassed above the dead men, cut, carved, slashed them, till the 5 corpses were a score of stumps rolling about the deck. The heads seemed to cry out. Streams of blood twisted in and out of the planks with every pitch of the vessel." End quote. So there's no doubt that the subject matter of that passage is very interesting. And that's really only about half of that section that I initially wanted to read. It keeps going and it's still interesting, but I didn't want to go on for too long in one spot. But this is a type of danger that existed on a ship in the 18th and probably into the 19th century that certainly happened some unknown number of times. So Hugo here has fictionalized an account of this happening, but this is something that happens sometimes, that somebody fails to properly secure a cannon and it gets loose on the gun deck on this lower level of the ship, and it's rolling around because the ship is moving in the waves. It's rolling here and there, and they have a really hard time getting it under control again. And this is, of course, no doubt the origin of the phrase loose cannon. But as an example of the tendency toward hyperbole in speech, you can look at the distance between somebody who you might call a loose cannon in ordinary everyday speech, someone who loses their temper easily, someone who can be a little unpredictable. Compare that person with this situation. Immediately, 5 guys are killed, and this could potentially sink the ship, because remember, they're out on the ocean. They're some number of miles from the shore, and there's no Coast Guard that's going to come for them if they sink. So this one moment of carelessness from the chief gunner, where he fails to properly secure the cannon, could sink the ship and kill everybody on board. That's what a real loose cannon is. And while the meaning of unpredictability and danger is present in the metaphor of calling someone who's unpredictable or unreliable a loose cannon, it might be better or equally valid to use the metaphor in the context of a small oversight that causes a big problem. And I'm always interested in the origin of words and phrases and etymology and where a certain expression comes from, because I like to see how the past, how history has its echoes in our everyday life, that there are little phrases or rules or customs by which we have this connection to the past, whether we're aware of it or not. So even if someone is indifferent to history, they don't care about these kinds of historical connections, which if you're listening to this podcast, you're probably not one of those people. But even such a person hears these echoes, whether they can recognize them as such or not. There are elements of their daily life that are connected to the recent or middle or ancient past, whether or not they're aware of it. So there's no doubt that Hugo picked an interesting subject to write about in this passage. The danger of the situation immediately grabs the attention, but also his description of it is powerful. When we listen to that, we feel like we're powerless in front of this 10,000-pound cannon rolling around on the gun deck. And rereading that passage after having finished the book, I don't think it would be going too far to suggest that Hugo was thinking of this cannon as a metaphor for the revolution itself, or suggesting some kind of resemblance. Hugo appears to avoid taking sides in this novel. He doesn't portray either the royalists or the Republicans as villains or heroes, or rather both sides do some heinous things, and also he gives both sides a chance to make their case, to explain what they think it is they're doing and why they're doing it. But there's a fact about revolutions or about society, which is that once it gets off the chain, once the government establishing order is overthrown, and before a new one is in place, things can go in any direction, and they can become very bloody, as they did in 1793. And it's quite difficult to get them under control again. So the comparison between the loose cannon and the revolution is so apt that I think it has to be intentional, especially since he devotes so much time to its violence and the lack of control over it. In another section, the Marquis de Lantenac, he's sort of a main character, is off by himself, and a beggar helps him. But the Marquis is trying to understand if the beggar is trying to trick him because there's a bounty on the Marquis's head, and he's kind of in enemy territory, and he's trying to get back to his command. And so he's been asking the beggar some questions about his allegiances, whether he's a royalist or a Republican, and the Marquis is a royalist. And the beggar has been trying to say that he's neutral, that he is not on either side. And Hugo writes, quote, "The Marquis began to question this man. So, no matter whether anything or nothing happens, it is all the same to you? Pretty much. You are the lords, you others. Those are your affairs. But after all, present events pass away up out of my reach," the beggar added presently. "Then there are things that go on still higher up. The sun that rises, the moon that increases or diminishes. Those are the matters I occupy myself about." He took a sip from the jug and said, "The good fresh water," end quote. And this is something that appears a couple times in the book. Commentary about what is above political concerns, what's beyond that, what's more important, more universal. And then there's a description of what's going on back in the cities, socially, as the revolution rolls along. Up to that point, the story had been mostly at sea and out in the countryside on the coast of France. And he's talking about boxes at the opera. He means boxes at the Paris Opera. Hugo writes, quote, "The Germans were at the gates. A report was current that the King of Prussia had secured boxes at the opera. Everything was terrible, and no one was frightened. The mysterious law against the suspected, which was the crime of Merlin of Douai, held a vision of the guillotine above every head. A solicitor named Suran, who had been denounced, awaited his arrest in dressing gown and slippers, playing his flute at his window. Nobody seemed to have leisure. All the world was in a hurry." Skipping ahead. "An attack of public madness made its appearance. It had already been seen 80 years before. The people came out from under Louis XIV as they did from under Robespierre with a great need to breathe, hence the Regency which opened that century and the Directory which closed it. 2 Saturnalia after 2 terrorisms. France snatched the wicket key and got beyond the Puritan cloister just as it did beyond that of monarchy, with the joy of a nation that escapes. After the 9th Thermidor, Paris was gay, but with an insane gaiety. An unhealthy joy overflowed all bounds. To the frenzy for dying succeeded the frenzy for living, and grandeur eclipsed itself." End quote. And the 9th Thermidor is the 9th day of the month of Thermidor. One of the things that happened in the French Revolution was that they set up a new calendar that didn't last very long. It was in use from 1793 to 1805, so about 12 years. But on the 9th day of the month of Thermidor, which was July 27th, 1794, there was a revolt in the Revolutionary Parliament that ended in the fall and execution of Robespierre, who was a major force behind the Reign of Terror. And that's why he writes, quote, "After the 9th Thermidor, Paris was gay, but with an insane gaiety. An unhealthy joy overflowed all bounds. To the frenzy for dying succeeded the frenzy for living, and grandeur eclipsed itself." End quote. So the frenzy for death, the Reign of Terror, was outdone by a wild frenzy for living that happened after Robespierre fell. And Hugo also describes how statues were torn down during the revolution. Describing one of the characters, he says, quote, "It was he who, 2 days after the 10th of August, headed the people to overthrow the statues of the kings. They slaughtered as they fell. In the Place Vendôme, a woman called Reine Violet was crushed by the statue of Louis XIV, about whose neck she had put a cord which she was pulling. This statue of Louis XIV had been standing 100 years. It was erected the 12th of August, 1692. It was overthrown the 12th of August, 1792. End quote. In another part of the book, there's a meeting between 3 real historical figures, Maximilien Robespierre, Georges Danton, and Jean-Paul Marat, all of whom are leaders of the revolution. Hugo writes, quote, "Danton had just risen and pushed his chair hastily back. 'Listen,' he cried, 'there's only one thing imminent, the peril of the Republic. I only know one thing, to deliver France from the enemy. To accomplish that, all means are fair. All. When I have to deal with a combination of dangers, I have recourse to every or any expedient. When I fear all, I have all. My thought is a lioness. No half measures, no squeamishness in resolution. Nemesis is not a conceited prude. Let us be terrible and useful. Does the elephant stop to look where he sets his foot? We must crush the enemy.' Robespierre replied mildly, 'I shall be very glad.' And he added, 'The question is to know where the enemy is.' 'It is outside, and I have chased it there,' said Danton. 'It is within, and I watch it,' said Robespierre. 'And I will continue to pursue it,' resumed Danton. 'One does not drive away an internal enemy. What then do you do? Exterminate it.' 'I agree to that,' said Danton in his turn. Then he continued, 'I tell you, Robespierre, it is without. Danton, I tell you, it is within. Robespierre, it is on the frontier. Danton, it is in Vendée.' 'Calm yourselves,' said a third voice. 'It is everywhere, and you are lost.' It was Marat who spoke." End quote. And this novel has 3 different parts that show events from different perspectives, and they're not necessarily in chronological order. As you noticed, the 9th of Thermidor was described earlier, but here we have Robespierre talking to his fellow leaders about what they ought to do next. And you can see the kind of language that they're using about where the enemy is and how they ought to exterminate it. And later Marat says, quote, "What I have said to you means this. You are both mistaken. The danger is neither in London, as Robespierre believes, nor in Berlin, as Danton believes. It is in Paris. It is in the absence of unity, in the right that each one has to draw his own conclusions. To commence with you two, in minds groveling in the dust, in the anarchy of wills." End quote. So he says that the danger is in the right that each one has to draw his own conclusions. That's one example of the kind of madness that can spread in a revolutionary context. Later, the beggar is reflecting on an ethical problem in something that he did. And Hugo writes, quote, "This whole adventure overwhelmed him, for in that which he had done he perceived a sort of enigma. He meditated dolorously. A good action might sometimes be evil. He who saves the wolf kills the sheep. He who sets the vulture's wing is responsible for his talons. He felt himself, in truth, guilty." End quote. And there's a larger illustration of this problem in the novel, but here it's put very simply. And this is, as I mentioned earlier, that tension between deontological ethics, ethics based on a set of rules, like don't lie, and consequentialist ethics, or ethics based on the result of actions. And the question asked in the story is whether if you save somebody's life and they go on to do something horrible, are you then responsible in part or in full for what they did? Especially if letting them die involved no active participation on your part, letting them die was the passive action, and saving their life required your action. You had to do something active, not be passive in order to save them, and then they go on to do something terrible. And on the one hand, I might be inclined to say, yes, you are partially responsible. But the problem is that you can't know what somebody's going to do. Or at least, I think the level of your own knowledge has to play a part in this. Because if everybody were afraid to help anybody else, because by helping them they thereby become responsible for whatever they do during the rest of their lives, then everybody would be very cautious to help anybody because you can't take on that responsibility. And further, this could very easily creep in the other direction where somebody could say, well, that person is going to or might in the future do something, and therefore it's moral for me to kill them now, which is a kind of preemptive war or preemptive social control or something. And we obviously couldn't live in a world like that. But on the other hand, if you somehow had knowledge that somebody was on their way to do something horrible, if they were going to murder somebody and they fell in a pit or something, they got into some situation where they needed your help and you helped them, and then they went on to murder the person, then you bear some responsibility in that situation because you knew that they were going to do it. Commenting on maternity, Hugo writes, quote, "Maternity is inexplicable. You cannot argue with it. That it is which renders a mother sublime. She becomes unreasoning. The maternal instinct is divinely animal. The mother is no longer a woman. She is a wild creature. Her children are her cubs. Hence in the mother there is something at once inferior and superior to argument. A mother has an unerring instinct. The immense, mysterious will of creation is within her and guides her. Hers is a blindness superhumanly enlightened." End quote. And later talking about construction and destruction. And it seems today that there's a lot of language, a lot of stories, a lot of TV shows that are about fighting something, about destroying something. And it seems to my eye that there are fewer stories that are about building something up, especially building something up over a long period of time, very patiently, very carefully, with a lot of work by a lot of people in a high quality way. And that might in part be because there is a human impulse to destruction, to tearing things down, that's a bit stronger than the human impulse for construction. It takes more work and intelligence and care and attention, more labor to build something than it does to tear it down. And that's part of what Hugo is getting at here. He writes, quote, "On the opposite side from the breach, a stone bridge was connected with the tower, having 3 arches still in almost perfect preservation. This bridge had supported a building of which some fragments remained. It had evidently been destroyed by fire. There were left only portions of the framework, between whose blackened ribs the daylight peeped, as it rose beside the tower like a skeleton beside a phantom. This ruin is today completely demolished. Not a trace of it is left. It only needs 1 day and a single peasant to destroy that which it took many centuries and many kings to build." End quote. And there's a situation where there are 19 guys inside of a fortress, 19 royalists, and 4,000 Republicans outside of it. The book describes this means of communication between these two forces, whereby one side can signal with their trumpet that they want to say something. And the way they do it is they signal once to kind of get the other side's attention, and then they signal again to say, "Hey, I have something to say. Will you listen?" And then if the other side answers the suitable response, that means something like, "Yes, we're ready to listen," also with their trumpet, then the first side can send a guy out or have him yell from a high place or something. And I had always thought of trumpets used in warfare in the past to communicate with your own side, to signal charge or retreat or whatever. But here Hugo is describing how it was used to communicate with the other side, or at least to first establish contact so that a more complicated message could be conveyed some other way. And there's a pretty dramatic situation set up toward the end of the novel. These two sides are facing off, and the side inside the fortress are talking to the guys outside, and Hugo writes, quote, "We have on our hands 3 prisoners, who are 3 children. These children were adopted by one of your regiments, and they belong to you. We offer to surrender these 3 children to you on one condition. It is that we shall depart freely. If you refuse, listen well. You can only attack us in one of 2 ways, by the breach on the side of the forest, or by the bridge on the side of the plateau. The building on the bridge has 3 stories. In the lower story, I, Imanus, I who speak to you, have put 6 hogsheads of tar and 100 fascines of dried heath. In the top story there is straw. In the middle story there are books and papers. The iron door which communicates between the bridge and the tower is closed, and Monseigneur carries the key. I have myself made a hole under the door, and through this hole passes a sulfur slow match, one end of which is in the tar and the other within reach of my hand inside the tower. I can fire it when I choose. If you refuse to let us go out, The 3 children will be placed in the second floor of the bridge, between the story where the sulfur match touches the tar and the floor where the straw is, and the iron door will be shut on them. If you attack by the bridge, it will be you who set the building on fire. If you attack by the breach, it will be we. If you attack by the breach and the bridge at the same time, the fire will be kindled at the same instant by us both, and in any case, the 3 children will perish. Now, accept or refuse. If you accept, we come out. If you refuse, the children die. I have spoken. The man speaking from the top of the tower became silent. A voice from below cried, "We refuse." The voice was abrupt and severe. Another voice, less harsh though firm, added, "We give you 24 hours to surrender at discretion." There was a silence. Then the same voice continued, "Tomorrow, at this hour, if you have not surrendered, we commence the assault." And the first voice resumed, "And then no quarter." End quote. So the royalists inside the tower are saying, if you let us go free, you can have these 3 children. If you don't let us go free and you attack us, the children are going to die. Now, on the one hand, that's pretty much something that you absolutely shouldn't do. That is, sacrifice children even to save your own life. But then, given that the other side has done this, they've made this move. Now the attackers have this difficult choice to make, which is whether to proceed with the attack or not. They don't get to choose what the other side does, they only get to choose what they do in response. And they also choose to proceed with the attack, or to threaten to do so, in order to capture or kill this group of guys. They're not willing to let these 19 guys go in order to save 3 children. And this is an interesting microcosm because pretty much any war will have dead innocents in it. It will have some dead children, almost any war. So here in this illustration, it's drawn out in the context of a single battle. But any world leader who makes the decision to go to war, or leads a government into a war, is making a similar decision, which is that to pursue my political goals or military goals, dead children are an acceptable outcome, or at least an acceptable possibility. And meanwhile, as this situation is progressing, Hugo writes this nice passage about the importance and value of children in general. Georgette is one of the 3 kids. And I think all 3 of them are supposed to be like 1 to 4 years old. They're very little. Hugo writes, quote, "Georgette prattled. A bird sings, a child prattles. But it is the same hymn indistinct, inarticulate, but full of profound meaning. The child, unlike the bird, has the somber destiny of humanity before it. This thought saddens any man who listens to the joyous song of a child. The most sublime psalm that can be heard on this earth is the lisping of a human soul from the lips of childhood. This confused murmur of thought, which is as yet only instinct, holds a strange unreasoning appeal to eternal justice. Perchance it is a protest against life while standing on its threshold, a protest unconscious yet heartrending. This ignorance, smiling at infinity, lays upon all creation the burden of the destiny which shall be offered to this feeble, unarmed creature. If unhappiness comes, it seems like a betrayal of confidence. The babble of an infant is more and less than speech. It is not measured, and yet it is a song. Not syllables, and yet a language. A murmur that began in heaven and will not finish on earth. It commenced before human birth and will continue in the sphere beyond. These lispings are the echo of what the child said when he was an angel, and of what he will say when he enters eternity. The cradle has a yesterday just as the grave has a tomorrow. This morrow and this yesterday join their double mystery in that incomprehensible warbling, and there is no such proof of God, of eternity, and the duality of destiny, as in this awe-inspiring shadow flung across that flower-like soul. There was nothing saddening in Georgette's prattle. Her whole lovely face was a smile. Her mouth smiled, her eyes smiled, the dimples in her cheeks smiled. There was a serene acceptance of the morning in this smile. The soul has faith in the sunlight. The sky was blue, warm, beautiful. This frail creature, who knew nothing, who comprehended nothing, softly cradled in a dream which was not thought, felt herself in safety amidst the loveliness of nature. These sturdy trees, this pure verdure, this landscape fair and peaceful, with its noises of birds, brooks, insects, leaves, above which glowed the brightness of the sun." End quote. And that passage is an example of it. But if you read the whole book, there are other sections where Hugo is dealing with this tension that comes about when political goals and allegiances and expediency conflicts with actual humanity, with people's lives, and especially the lives of children, and how different characters respond to that tension. Later, Simordan, who's among the Republicans, he's outside of this fortress, and he's one of the main characters. He addresses the soldiers who are inside after they've given this offer, and his side has refused and announced that they would attack the next day at that time, which, by the way, I would call that an example of chivalry or gentlemanliness in warfare as late as the late 18th century, and it's comparable to some of the stuff that we saw in Franzon, the chronicles that we looked at a few weeks ago. That is, the other side tells them when they're going to attack. They say, if at this time tomorrow you haven't surrendered, then we're going to attack, which they don't necessarily have to do. They could say, we can attack at any time. If you want, you can surrender, but you better do so quickly. Anyway, Simordan goes to them and he says, quote, I come here under a flag of truce. Yes, you are my brothers. You are poor, mistaken creatures. I am your friend. I am the light, and I speak to ignorance. Light is always brotherhood. Besides, have we not all the same mother, our country? Well, listen to me. You will know hereafter, or your children will know, or your children's children will know, that what is done in this moment is brought about by the law above, and that the revolution is the work of God. While awaiting the time when all consciences, even yours, shall understand this, when all fanaticism, even yours, shall vanish, while waiting for this great light to spread, will no one have pity on your darkness? I come to you. I offer you my head. I do more. I hold out my hand to you. I demand of you the favor to destroy me in order to save yourselves. I have unlimited authority, and that which I say, I can do. This is a supreme instant. I make a last effort. Yes, he who speaks to you is a citizen, and in this citizen, yes, there is a priest. The citizen defies you, but the priest implores you. Listen to me. Many among you have wives and children. I'm defending your children and your wives, defending them against yourselves. Oh, my brothers, go on, preach, sneered Imanus. My brothers, do not let the terrible horn sound. Throats are to be cut. Many among us who are here before you will not see tomorrow's sun. Yes, many of us will perish, and you are all going to die. Show mercy to yourselves. Why shed all this blood when it is useless? Why kill so many men when it would suffice to kill two? Two? Repeated Imanus. Yes, two. Who? Lantenac and myself. Simordain spoke more loudly. 2 men are too many. Lantenac for us, I for you. This is what I propose to you, and you will all have your lives safe. Give us Lantenac, and take me. Lantenac will be guillotined, and you shall do what you choose with me. Priest, howled Imanus, if we had thee, we would roast thee at a slow fire. I consent, said Simordan. He went on, you, the condemned who are in this tower, you can all in an hour be living and free. I bring you safety. Do you accept? Imanus burst forth. You are not only a villain, you are a madman. Why do you come here to disturb us? Who begged you to come and speak to us? We give up Monseigneur. What is it you want? His head. And I offer your skin. Oh, we would flay you like a dog, Curé Simordan. Well, no. Your skin is not worth his head. Get away with you. The massacre will be horrible. For the last time, reflect. Night had come on during this strange colloquy, which could be heard without and within the tower. The Marquis de Lantenac kept silence and allowed events to take their course. Leaders possess such sinister egotism. It is one of the rights of responsibility. Imanus sent his voice beyond Simordan. He shouted, Men who attack us, we have submitted our propositions to you. They are settled. We have nothing to change in them. Accept them, else woe to all. Do you consent? We will give you up the 3 children, and you will allow liberty and life to us all. To all, yes, replied Simordan, except one, and that? Lantenac. Monseigneur. Give up Monseigneur? Never. We can only treat with you on that condition. Then begin. Silence fell. Imanus descended after having sounded the signal on his horn. The Marquis took his sword in his hand. The 19 besieged grouped themselves in silence behind the red arrayed of the lower hall and sank upon their knees. They could hear the measured tread of the column as it advanced toward the tower in the gloom. The sound came nearer. Suddenly they heard it close to them, at the very mouth of the breach. Then, all kneeling, aimed their guns and blunderbusses across the openings of the barricade, and one of them, Grand Francoeur, who was the priest of Tremont, raised himself, with a naked saber in his right hand and a crucifix in his left, saying, in a solemn voice, In the name of the Father, of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. All fired at the same time, and the battle began. End quote. So Simordan comes out, and he adjusts the deal. He says, not everybody has to surrender. We only want Lantenac, and in exchange you can have me. And the 19 on the inside refuse that as well. And it's interesting that Lantenac doesn't say anything. He lets the event play out, however it's going to play out, because the 18 other guys could have easily overpowered him and delivered him up to save themselves, but they don't do that. And so that battle begins, and that whole sequence is very interesting, and how that plays out and the events after it play out is all very interesting, but I'm not going to read any of that in case you haven't read this book yet and you want to go check it out. And this next one is a conversation between two of the characters about the ideal republic. And it's a little bit difficult to follow in audio because it has a lot of back and forth dialogue, but it's not very long, and I think you'll still be able to get something out of it. Hugo writes, quote, "I prefer," said Gauvin, "the ideal republic." He paused for an instant, then continued, "O my master, in all which you have just said, where do you place devotion, sacrifice, abnegation, the sweet interlacing of kindnesses, love? To set all in equilibrium, it is well. To put all in harmony, it is better. Above the balance is the lyre. Your republic weighs, measures, regulates man. Mine lifts him into the open sky. It is the difference between a theorem and an eagle. You lose yourself in the clouds. And you in calculation. Harmony is full of dreams. There are such too in algebra. I would have man made by the rules of Euclid. And I," said Gauvin, "would like him better as pictured by Homer." Simordan's severe smile remained fixed upon Gauvin, as if to hold that soul steady. "Poesy. Mistrust poets." "Yes, I know that saying. Mistrust the zephyrs, mistrust the sunshine, mistrust the sweet odors of spring, mistrust the flowers, mistrust the stars. None of these things can feed man. How do you know? Thought is nourishment. To think is to eat." End quote. And in the last passage that I want to show you, the Marquis de Lantenac gives a monologue that is so full of historical references that I don't have time to look up and explain all of them, but I've noted them all, and I personally am going to go and learn about each one. Some of them I know, a lot of them I don't. I imagine it'll be something similar for you. Having glanced at each one, it's enough to say that he's referencing a lot of significant leaders and heroes and battles from French history. And the fact that these aren't common knowledge anymore, the way that they maybe were for Hugo's readers, in a certain way proves the point that Lantenac is making. And as usual, I'll do my best with the French pronunciation here, but I don't speak French. I looked up pronunciations where I could find them, but I'm sure I'm about to massacre these. So I hope any French speakers out there can excuse me for that, and here we go. Hugo writes, quote, No scribblers. As long as there are fellows who scribble, there will be scoundrels who assassinate. As long as there is ink, there will be black stains. As long as men's claws hold a goose's feather, frivolous stupidities will engender atrocious ones. Books cause crimes. The word chimera has two meanings. It signifies dream, and it signifies monster. How dearly one pays for idle trash. What is that you sing to us about your rights? The rights of man, rights of the people. Is that empty enough, stupid enough, visionary enough, sufficiently void of sense? Your scoundrels, your rascals, your wretches, what do they call their rights? Deicide and regicide. Is it not hideous? So be it, citizens. You are masters. Reign, take your ease, do what you like, stop at nothing. All this does not hinder the fact that religion is religion, that royalty fills 1,500 years of our history, and that the old French nobility are loftier than you, even with their heads off. As for your cavilling over the historic rights of royal races, we shrug our shoulders at that. Chilperic in reality was only a monk named Daniel. It was Renfant who invented Chilperic in order to annoy Charles Martel. We know those things just as well as you do. The question does not lie there. The question is this: to be a great kingdom, to be the ancient France, to be a country perfectly ordered, wherein were to be considered first the sacred person of its monarchs, absolute lords of the state, then the princes, then the officers of the crown for the armies on land and sea, for the artillery, for the direction and superintendence of the finances. After that, the officers of justice, great and small, those for the management of taxes and general receipts, and lastly, the police of the kingdom in its 3 orders. All this was fine and nobly regulated. You have destroyed it. You have destroyed the provinces, like the lamentably ignorant creatures you are, without even suspecting what the provinces really were. The genius of France held the genius of the entire continent. Each province of France represented a virtue of Europe. The frankness of Germany was in Picardy, the generosity of Sweden in Champagne, the industry of Holland and Burgundy, the activity of Poland and Languedoc, the gravity of Spain and Gascony, the wisdom of Italy and Provence, the subtlety of Greece and Normandy, the fidelity of Switzerland and Dauphiny. You knew nothing of all that. You have broken, shattered, ruined, demolished. You have shown yourselves simply idiotic brutes. You will no longer have nobles? Well, you shall have none. Get your mourning ready. You shall have no more paladins, no more heroes. Say good night to the ancient grandeurs. Find me a Dassas at present. You are all of you afraid for your skins. You will have no more the chivalry of Fontenoy, who saluted before killing one another. You will have no more combatants like those in silk stockings at the siege of Lerida. You will have no more plumes floating past like meteors. You are a people finished, come to an end. You will suffer the outrage of invasion. If Alaric II could return, he would no longer find himself confronted by Clovis. If Abd al-Rahman could come back, he would no longer find himself face to face with Charles Martel. If the Saxons, they would no longer find Pepin before them. You will have no more Agnadel, Rocroi, Lens, Stafford, Neerwenden, Steinkirk, La Massée, Rocon, Lafelde, Marlion. You will have no Marignan with Francis I. You will have no Beauvinet with Philip Augustus taking prisoner with one hand Ranat, Count of Bologna, and with the other Ferrand, Count of Flanders. You will have Agincourt, but you will have no more the Sieur de Bacqueville, grand bearer of the Oriflamme, enveloping himself in his banner to die. Go on, do your work, be the new men, become dwarfs. The Marquis was silent for an instant, then began again. But leave us great. Kill the kings, kill the nobles, kill the priests, tear down, ruin, massacre, trample underfoot, crush ancient laws beneath your heels, overthrow the throne, stamp upon the altar of God, dash it in pieces, dance above it. On with you to the end. You are traitors and cowards, incapable of devotion or sacrifice." End quote. And those are the passages that I wanted to show you from 93 by Victor Hugo. This was an example of historical fiction, and I sort of go back and forth on historical fiction. It can be harmful to read historical fiction rather than history because you can sometimes get a wrong impression of an event or a period. I find that's more the case in film and TV shows. Often if somebody's written a historical fiction novel, they've gone to some trouble to try to make it accurate based on the period. But especially in TV shows, there can be inaccuracies that give you a wrong impression of the period, and that's obviously not good. What historical fiction can do at its best is not only make learning about the past a little bit more palatable to people who maybe don't necessarily usually read history, though I think that's a smaller group. I think people who read historical fiction tend to often be people who are interested in history. And the best thing that historical fiction can do is humanize history. It puts you in touch with the personal side of it. And it reminds you that when you read history, you are reading about people and not points of data. That behind every battle and every meeting and every event, there are real humans whose lives were affected by that event. And the documented history that is left to us is a very faint shadow of the fullness and richness of what it was actually like to live through that. We can only guess, but it must have been, because any account of our day-to-day lives would not compare to actually living them. And historical fiction reminds us of that. If you were to read a book about the French Revolution, it would be very interesting and there would probably be some personal anecdotes in there. But having first read a book like 93 and then reading a factual academic history of the French Revolution would be a different experience because you would be first primed with this feeling of all the individual people involved and how they were affected by what happened. And so then when you read a sentence over which you might have sailed without thinking about it too much before, about some atrocity or some battle or a ship that sank, you're instead a little bit primed to remember that that by itself is a huge event. A ship sinking is a big deal. I've never seen a ship sink, but when a ship sinks, usually a bunch of people die and a big expensive thing that took a long time to build is destroyed. But when you're reading a history book, never mind one ship sinking, 50 ships sinking can just be a footnote. It can be a fact that you roll over. And historical fiction can help to keep history in perspective in a certain way. And 93, among many other things, did that very effectively. And those were not only the passages that I wanted to read you from 93, those were the final passages that I wanted to read you in 2023. When I started this podcast at the beginning of the year, I wasn't sure how far I would be able to get with it. I didn't know how much time it would take up. I didn't know if I would be able to do it how I imagined it. I didn't know if it would be interesting to anybody. And I've certainly been on a learning curve in terms of production and how to best do this. Each one, I feel like I improve my process a little bit. But I'm pleased to have found that there are a lot of fine people out there who are just as interested in these books as I am. And I knew when I started that my target listener was a rare and thoughtful person and part of a small group, of which you are a member, since you made it to the end of at least one episode. But that target person is someone for whom I genuinely want to work to create some value. As I've said, I'm married and I have a full-time job, and it takes a lot of work to put together this podcast. But I hope that it has been valuable to you, either to get some information about books that you haven't read, to hear somebody else's thoughts about books you have read, to maybe think about what you might want to read in the future, to learn some history, to hear some thoughts about life generally. I hope this has been useful to you, and I thank you very much for listening. I have a good list of books planned for what I want to read in 2024, about which I'm very excited, and I hope you'll join me for that as well. And if you have enjoyed listening to this podcast, I hope you'll go over to my website, volrathpublishing.com. The link is in the description, and pick up a copy of the edition of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein that I printed. I have it with original cover art, 97 footnotes throughout the book that define some of the unusual vocabulary words that Mary Shelley uses, some of her literary, historical, geographical references. My edition has excellent print quality. I have it at a good price with free shipping. Frankenstein is one of those books that I think everybody should read. It's not very long. It's very fast-paced. It has a lot to talk about, a lot to think about. And if you haven't read it, you should order yourself a copy and do so immediately. In the meantime, Merry Christmas, Happy New Year. See you in 2024. Farewell until next time. Take care and happy reading.